was looking for a car to buy for my son for his 18th birthday. I was searching all the typical car websites, cars.com, eBay Motors. They were all overpriced as expected. Craigslist was the only place to find an actual deal. About a week into my search, I found an '03 Toyota Camry. It had 67,000 miles, no accidents, no damage, and good condition for only $3,500. This seemed like a steal for such a reliable car with such low mileage. The seller lived about 10 miles from me, which was a reasonable drive when looking for a car. I gave him a call to set up a time to come check it out. The man sounded normal on the phone. He assured me there were absolutely no problems with the car. He introduced himself as Bob. I brought along $3,500 in cash, even though I planned on wiggling down the price as much as possible. I pulled up the dirt road to Bob's property about 15 minutes early. It was a tiny little house with a decent-sized property, only because it was a bit far from the nearest neighbors. The garage was open, so I looked over to see if anyone was inside, but except for an unusual amount of car parts, it was empty. The car was nowhere in sight. The only car on the property was an old pickup truck. I went over to the front door to check the house numbers. It was the right address. The doorbell button was missing, so I knocked on the front door. I knocked every once in a while for exactly 5 minutes before deciding to give the man a call. So I dialed his number, and I heard the sound of his phone ringing from inside the house. I was extremely confused at this point. Now I knew I had the right house. I didn't understand why, if he was home, why he wasn't answering. I decided I had to take a peek through one of the windows to see if anyone was inside. Peering through the glass, I couldn't really see much as it was pretty dark inside the house. I saw a very old-fashioned dining room set, but across from that, I saw somebody standing at the back door of the house, staring outside. I figured that must have been Bob, so I knocked on the window, but he didn't even move. There was no gate or anything to the backyard. It was just a wide open yard since this wasn't a rural area. I simply walked around the house to the backyard. I didn't understand how he couldn't hear me. When I got to the back door, I made a shocking realization. The figure standing by the door was a taxidermied human being. I ran straight back the way I came and back to my car. I looked up one last time before driving off. The blinds to the window I had peeked into had been shut, but I could see 2 of the blinds creased open. Somebody was at that window, watching me. You could probably guess I had the gas pedal to the floor the whole way home. The whole situation still makes no sense. All the car parts, the fact that there was no Toyota Camry, the taxidermied human being. Given that there was no car there, leads me to believe that whoever that man was wasn't planning on selling me anything. And that also leads me to the disturbing thought that I was very close to becoming a lifeless statue staring out that man's back door. This happened when I was really little and often left alone with my single mom. She always came to check on me every night when she would get up to go to the bathroom. This one night in particular, I remember waking up thinking I heard something in my closet. I looked up and my mom was at the foot of my bed giving me a playful wave. She told me to go back to sleep. She then went into my closet and pulled the door until it was just barely open, and she just stood in there, poking her head through the crack of the barely open closet. I remember vividly seeing her eye peeking through the crack at me. I laughed like any little kid would do in that situation, and then fell asleep moments later. When I was eating cereal the next morning, I asked my mom why she was hiding in my closet last night, and she just stopped and gave me a puzzled and concerned look. She told me she hadn't been in the room all night. At first she assumed somebody had broken into the house, but she soon realized it was some kind of hallucination or dream. Since this experience, I've only had 2 other hallucinations, neither of them as vivid or as creepy as this one. In the year 2009, I was spending a weekend with my uncle on his ranch when my parents were renovating the new house we had just bought. It was my second night there, a Saturday, and it happened to be during one of the biggest thunderstorms of the year. I'd say there were at least 3 crashes of thunder and lightning per minute. And we were in the heart of the storm because the thunder would crash not even a second after the lightning would. I always enjoyed listening to storms while laying in bed. So I stayed up a little later watching TV, just enjoying the ambiance. After the movie I was watching finally ended, I turned off the TV and tried to fall asleep. As I heard the lightning strike from outside, I could have sworn I heard some kind of metallic thud coming from outside at the same time. I didn't pay it too much mind. 20 seconds later, I could have sworn I heard it again. A very distinct metallic thud coming from outside to match the timing of the lightning. I really don't mean to make this sound like a cliche horror story, but my uncle really is a kind of creepy guy, and I was never close with him even remotely. So for that reason, I didn't feel right going to wake him up. I just tried to forget about it. Now I was getting concerned. What the hell could that be? After the 3rd time, I finally got out of bed and walked over to the window of the guest bedroom. The water pouring down on the window made it extra hard to see what was out there in the dark fields. A flash of lightning momentarily lit up the property, but I couldn't see anything. However, once again, the sound of a metal hit accompanied it. The sound was so close now, it sounded like it was coming from the left of the window at a blind spot. I was going to do something I knew my uncle wouldn't be happy about. It would be a bit messy, but I was going to open the window and peer outside to see if I could see what the sound was. I unhooked the window lock and slid it up, and immediately the wind of the storm blew drops of rain into the room and onto me. I stuck my head out the window and looked to the left. And at that very moment, lightning lit up the property once again, and I could see a person dressed in all black crouched down by the outside basement door with his hand raised in the air. And before the sky went dark, I caught the briefest glimpse of what the sound was coming from. The person was bashing at the basement door lock. I pulled my head in and quietly shut the window, making sure to lock it. I was in a panic. I feared he might have seen or heard me. I ran back to bed and pretended to be asleep, facing away from the window. Lightning crashed once again, but this time there was no metallic thud. My heart must have dropped as I realized this. I just stayed put in bed for the longest time, hoping whoever was out there would go away. After maybe 3 more lightning crashes without any thuds accompanying them, I thought it would be safe to go tell my uncle. I turned to face the window and screamed. There was a figure clear as day standing at the window looking in at me. I screamed as loud as I could and ran straight to my uncle's room. He went outside with his hunting rifle with nothing on but his pajamas, not even socks. He ran around the entire property yelling like a madman, but didn't find anyone. The next morning we were able to better see the marks on the basement door lock. It was almost bashed open. Maybe 3 or 4 more good hits would have done it, according to my uncle. He was proud of me for picking up on it. Luckily, I was out of there that same day. My uncle hasn't told us of any incidents since, so I think he's been okay. Not that we talked to him much at all. I'm grateful I stayed up a little later that night watching that movie, because I may have just stopped a robbery, or possibly much worse. I don't care if anyone judges me, but I like to go to the movie theaters alone. My work schedule's all over the place. I often don't work weeknights. So on a stormy Wednesday night, a night not many other people would be thinking to go drive to a movie theater, I did just that. I always like avoiding crowds in anything I do. That's just how I am. It was 2017. I went to see some low-key movie that probably wasn't at the top of most people's must-see movie lists. I was the only one in the theater, just like I expected. I sat myself right in the center seat of one of the higher-up rows and put my feet up on the seat in front of me. About 20 minutes into the movie, I'd say, I noticed someone a few aisles down. I didn't notice them coming in. The theater was dark because the scene in the movie at the time was in a dark room. They weren't sitting in a seat like a normal person though. All I saw of them was the top half of their head, peering over one of the seats to be looking in a direction that definitely was not the screen. It was still too dark to be able to tell if they were looking directly at me or not, but when the scene changed to a brighter background, the whole theater got brighter. Bright enough to see they were looking basically at me. But their face was so pale and lifeless looking, and their hair messy and wiry looking, I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. I'm an introvert, or just an awkward person, so I didn't really want to ask if there was something wrong. I viewed that as confrontation. The screen went darker again, and at the same time, the person lowered down behind the chair completely until I couldn't see them anymore. They were completely hidden from my view. I couldn't concentrate on the movie now though. I was actually very uncomfortable. Actually quite terrified. I didn't get up though, I stayed put in my seat. Many scenes in the movie passed. I almost forgot about what happened. Almost. Just when I was getting back into the movie, the person's head appeared from behind a seat again. This time much closer, only like 3 rows of seats away from me. I actually let out a holy shit and a loud yell because it genuinely made me jump. Now I was able to see more detail or features in their face. They actually looked lifeless. Their eyes motionless, hung open. But still, I somehow couldn't tell if they were looking directly at me or not. Now I could better see it was a man with long, unkempt hair. I noped the F out of my seat and down the road to the exit. I had to pass the row in which the person was in to get to the exit door. As I passed the row, I looked down it, and while I expected to see the rest of the person's body sitting hunched behind the seats, instead what I saw was something you'd see in a nightmare. There was some guy basically laying on the floor, holding up a severed head perched on a stick. I didn't stick around to see if it was some sick joke or if the head was real or not. I ran for it through the exit door, and I ran out of the back exit of the building to the parking lot. I drove home in a panic, heart racing. That head looked so real. I got home and did some research about possible recent murders or missing people in the area, and I found something. After browsing a list of missing people in the area, I found the picture of a 17-year-old boy named Donald Watkins who had gone missing a month prior, and based on the picture I found, his face could have matched the head I saw in that theater. Of course, that could be my brain trying to connect any similarities, but the hair, the nose, the eyes, they looked like they could actually be a match. The next day, I simply made a call to the theater and told them the story and suggested they check their cameras and see if anything strange came up. I gave them my number to reach me if they needed to, but I never heard from them. I chose to not spend any more of my time on it. A long time ago, I very briefly lived with my good friend Ben on a quiet street in Northville, Michigan, perhaps notable for being close to Detroit. It wasn't the nicest house, or block, or area for that matter, but the price was unbeatable for 2 broke young men like ourselves. Ben and I went way back to when we were like 9 years old, and at the time of this story, we worked the same job, and rooming together with him seemed like a great idea. On our first day there, we quickly figured out that the creepy-looking house across the street with the overgrown grass and bushes was abandoned, as were a lot of the houses around the area. In fact, something we somehow hadn't noticed before, there was even graffiti next to one of the front windows and on the fence. Our neighbors on one side seemed like creeps, and we didn't even want to approach them. The neighbor on the other side was an older dude, a very interesting hippie-ish kind of guy. His name was Marv. He had long gray hair with a matching long gray beard. He seemed friendly at first, I guess, but also very weird and hard to talk to. We spoke with him on our second day there after work. He told us the place had been abandoned for as long as he could remember. That night, with the sun almost set, while we were sitting on the front stoop smoking, I looked to the house across the street and felt a little tingle in my stomach out of shock. I stood up, threw my cigarette onto the floor and crushed it. Ben looked at me confused, and I pointed to the window across the street. I was pointing at a face, which I saw staring at me through the lone upstairs window of the house. "Do you see that? There's someone at that window." Ben looked at the window immediately, but I saw the person move their head away before he could see it. "It's weird." I explained to Ben that I didn't even know if it was a male or female, old or young. The glass was just too foggy. All I knew was that I saw the eyes, and they were staring at us. Ben told me I was legitimately creeping him out. He believed me. We ran over to Marv's house to tell him, but strangely he didn't answer his door, even though we saw him watching TV in his tiny, messy living room through the window. The fact that the guy wouldn't answer creeped us out even more. "Dude, what the fuck is going on with this place?" Ben laughed, but the situation couldn't stay comical for long. Ben owned a katana. He brought it to mention and suggested we go across the street with it, break into the house from the backyard, and see what was going on. We were always adventurous, daring troublemakers as kids, so this was our natural response to the situation. When it got dark, we went across the street to the backyard, broke off the board holding the back door shut, and entered the house. We both had heavy-duty flashlights with us to light up basically any room we were in. The house was dusty, decrepit, but surprisingly seemed to remain untouched from the inside. No graffiti or signs of vandalism anywhere. Still, the place was disturbingly creepy, and we immediately joked that we should get the fuck out of there. But we pressed on. The first floor was pathetically small like our own. A kitchen, a tiny living room, and a dining room. There was no basement and one closet. The first floor was clear. We both agreed to check the upstairs. We tiptoed over to the stairs, and Ben, out of nowhere, screamed, "Is anybody up there?" "Dude, why the fuck would you do that?" I said quietly. Then we both froze in fear when we heard rapid stomping suddenly appear from above us. It was someone heavy, and it sounded like they were running over to the stairway. I literally felt like my heart stopped. Ben, the one with the katana, was the first to flee, grabbing my arm and tugging me with him. We went out the way we entered and ran back to the house, where we saw Marv just standing by his window, watching us. We didn't know what to do. He just intently stared at us as we froze to catch our breath in front of the house. We went inside, decided not to call the police, and moved out literally the next day. We explained to the landlord that the location was just too inconvenient for us, and we needed to leave ASAP. We drove away from that house and never looked back. For my son's 12th birthday, my wife and I threw him a little party in the backyard. We invited the whole family, as we usually did for any of our kids' birthdays, and let him invite all of his friends too. We live in rural New Jersey, so our backyard connects to forest on two sides. We also have a pretty big property, which allowed us to space out a bunch of tables on the grass with food and refreshments. The little party went into the night. Most of our guests left, but closer family and some of our friends stayed late. It was probably 8 o'clock. The mosquitoes were out in full force, so I decided to run over to the shed at the far end of the backyard by the woods to fetch the tiki torches. I grabbed like 6 torches and set them on the grass while I went back in to look for fuel. However, while I was in the shed, I heard steps in the woods. I stopped what I was doing to take a look out there. but honestly it was just too dark to see out into the woods. After finding the fuel, I went back to the part of the yard everyone else was at and pitched the torches into the ground. The 6 torches gave off a decent amount of light while keeping us safe from the blood-sucking pests. There were about 6 kids left, including my son, and they all wanted to play hide-and-seek in the woods. My wife and I allowed it, just making sure to tell them to stay close to the tree line. My son and his friends went to play their little game in the woods, which left the rest of us to sit in peace for a little bit. It was a solid 15 minutes of talking with relatives and hearing the kids laughing and yelling in the near distance out in the woods. But all of a sudden, the yelling turned to screams. Concerning sounding screams from the kids. All of us looked at each other, sitting up in concern. The kids one by one came running out of the woods, yelling that there's something in there. We don't have bears or any big predatory animals around here, so that was not the first thing we assumed it to be. I told all the kids to stay near the patio area. My brother Dom and I, being the biggest men there, decided to go investigate. We took a couple flashlights and off we went into the pitch black woods. The only sounds we heard around us were crickets and other night bugs. So we went deeper, and that's when we started to hear something else. It sounded like an animal at first, but as we followed the sound to get closer, the sound started to become more human-like. We continued to walk, and we agreed we both had the feeling that we were being watched, like stalked. I put my arm out to stop Dom. Standing in the silence now, the best way I could describe the sound we were hearing was a moaning, angry kind of sound. It sounded human, but it was a bizarre sound. Then, a few cracks of the leaves on the ground ahead of us. We aimed our lights over there, and there was someone or something behind the tree. The moaning sound stopped. Dom stepped forward and called out. What happened next was textbook horror movie stuff. A scream, so loud, so blood-curdling, so inhuman, filled the air. I'm sure it could be heard for miles. Dom and I turned and booked it back to the property. We waved at everyone to go inside when we made it back. Dom got on the phone with the sheriff's department. They said it was probably a wild animal. We wanted to insist it was a human, but we honestly couldn't. We to this day don't know who or what we saw and heard in those woods, but it was definitely stalking us and the kids when they were playing hide and seek. And that scream we heard, it just didn't sound human to us.
In what is probably the vast majority of cases involving murders, the guilty person is captured and brought to justice. This, of course, does not bring back the life that they stole, but it also allows the family of the victim to have a sense of closure. But what about those that actually manage to get away with murder? The following stories tell the tale of 3 incredibly evil people who got away with murder and never admitted to what they did until they were about to die. One victim was just a child for no reason, and another had been a long abuser before becoming a victim themselves. Still, others were simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the evening of August 5th, 1989, and 14-year-old Gina Brooks of Fredericktown, Missouri, was enjoying the summer day by watching her brother's baseball game. She was a beautiful, blonde-haired, green-eyed teenager with her whole life ahead of her. After the game ended, she would return home for a little while, before later deciding she was going to visit her boyfriend. He only lived 6 blocks away. That evening, Gina had already told her mother, Sydney, goodnight. and Cindy had gone to bed. She told her brother she was going out before she left on her bike at around 10 p.m. that night. Many hours passed by and eventually it was 2 a.m. Cindy happened to wake up in the night and decided to go check Gina's room, only to find it empty. It was then that she realized Gina still hadn't come home. Her mother was understandably frantic and called the police to report her daughter missing. Police began combing through the town searching for any signs of her. Eventually, they found her bicycle, which was abandoned on the side of the road about 5 blocks from her house, but she was nowhere around. Police also began questioning local neighbors to try to determine where Gina was last seen. They eventually find out that Gina was last seen nearby a local church. She had been seen standing near her bicycle when 3 men in a blue station wagon pulled up alongside her. They had been following her. When they got out of the car to try to talk to her, she must have realized she was in danger because she hopped off her bike and took off. While it wasn't clear to those who witnessed this exactly what happened, some people, including Gina's boyfriend, heard screams and watched as the station wagon took off at a high pace towards the highway. The whole town came out to search day and night for missing Gina, and her family were desperate to bring her back home. They hung up posters, searched local caves and woods, but sadly were never able to find even a trace of the young girl who was set to start 8th grade not long after she disappeared. The entire town, which was very small with only around 4,000 residents, was terrified and traumatized by this great loss. Year after year passed, and it appeared that this was going to be a cold case and that Gina's loved ones would never actually know what happened to her. But was this really the end of the story? Everything completely changed in September of 1996. There was a patient at St. Louis, Missouri hospital who was in the process of dying. He had not only had cancer but was suffering from complications from AIDS. He knew that his days were numbered. This patient was a man named Bryant Squires. In his very final days, he admitted to some of the nurses that he had information about not only 1, but 3 brutal unsolved murders. He was behind the slaying of 9-year-old Angie Houseman, who disappeared in November of 1993. Angie was from St. Anne, a suburb of St. Louis. With the help of another man, Bryant kidnapped her right after she got off the school bus. Her brutally beaten body was found tied to a tree just 9 days after she was missing. She had been horrifically and left for dead. She eventually died of sun exposure, among other wounds. Bryant did not reveal who his accomplice was for this crime. Bryant did reveal that a man named Nathan Williams had been behind the other murders, though. He said in 1975, Williams, who was only 14 at the time, had killed a 23-year-old woman named Laura Dinwiddie. Laura was a good person who worked as a volunteer with inner-city children and taught them sign language. Her naked dead body was found in her apartment. She had not only been but her throat was brutally slit. Finally, Bryant revealed what actually happened to Gina that tragic night that would change her loved ones' lives forever. On the night of Gina's disappearance, he had been one of the 3 men in the station wagon that confronted the teen. In fact, he had been behind the wheel. He claimed that the other 2 men with him were Nathan Williams and Timothy Bello. While working together, the men kidnapped Gina, her throat, and then disposed of her body. Not long after making these horrific confessions, Bryant would die. He would never have to pay for the horrible crimes that he committed. But what about Nathan and Timothy, who were still alive? Both of these men were arrested in 1999 in connection to Gina's murder. Timothy was hardly a first-time offender and had been in trouble with the law many times in the past, most commonly in connection with taking advantage of women. When questioned by police, Timothy didn't deny being connected to Gina's murder. He even described the supposed location of her body, which was a freezer on his father's vast 96-acre property. But while this area was searched thoroughly, police were never able to find Gina's remains. Tragically, Timothy's charges charges in connection to Gina's death would ultimately be dropped in 1999, and he would later be charged with lying to the FBI. The sentence he ended up receiving was only a measly 30 months behind bars, which is about 2.5 years. As if this wasn't already unfortunate enough, the charges against Nathan Williams in connection to Gina's case were also dropped. Law enforcement simply didn't believe that Bryant's deathbed confessions were the whole truth, and that Nathan could have been responsible for 2 different slayings. In fact, they even claimed that because Bryant had confessed to his nurses and not the police, his confessions were no longer valid. Additionally, the nurses hadn't come to the police to tell them about the confessions initially because they did not believe Bryant was actually of stable mind and telling the truth. However, Nathan would still have to pay for the other crimes he had been connected with, including having taken physical advantage of a little girl just a month after Gina's disappearance. He was also considered to be the person behind the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl named Tammy Sertum. Tammy of St. Charles, Missouri, disappeared during the beginning of August of 1975. Because Tammy was always running away from home, her family didn't report her as missing right away. But after she did not return home for a long period of time, her parents finally realized she had been the victim of foul play and notified the authorities. Nathan would later admit to not only kidnapping and taking advantage of young Tammy's body, but also to her to death and burying her body. Her remains were never discovered. Despite the evidence against him, Nathan has shockingly never actually been convicted of any murder. He did, however, get a sentence to a minimum of 30 years in prison in connection to his other charges. He is currently in prison at Jefferson County Correctional Center in Missouri. Geraldine Kelly, who went by Jerry, was quite simply not the average woman you would come across in the early 1990s. She was quite small and dark-haired, but she was also covered in tattoos, kept attack dogs as pets, and would even sometimes be spotted wearing an enormous boa constrictor around her neck. She was clearly not the type of person to be messed with, but what from her history would make her this way? Geraldine met her future husband, John Kelly, when they were both children. They went on to get married and later had 2 children, a daughter and a son. While things in their marriage may have started out okay, they took a turn for the worse in 1981. During a wedding one fateful evening, John had been drinking too much and ended up getting into a fight with some of the other wedding guests. While it's not clear exactly how it happened, the fight resulted in the death of his brother-in-law. John was terrified that he could be charged with murder, so he decided to pack up his family and move across the country. They settled in California, where he would land a job working at a motel. But during this time, he was still drinking heavily, and he and Geraldine would fight all the time, eventually causing their 2 children to move away and distance themselves from them. John was allegedly very abusive towards Geraldine for many years, causing her to become cold-hearted towards him. Eventually, the abuse became too much for her to bear, and she decided to take revenge upon her husband. She shot him dead and then placed his body in a freezer, where it remained for more than 6 years. Of course, no one, including law enforcement or Jerry's own family, was at all aware of what she had done to John for many years. She told her children that their dad had simply died in a car, and they had no reason to doubt this story. After all, why would she lie to them? It wasn't until around 6 years later that Jerry, now dying from breast cancer, would decide to come clean about what she had done. She told her daughter about the details of her husband's murder, and her daughter would soon after notify the proper authorities. Police went to go check the freezer Jerry had described, and sure enough, they discovered the remains of her former husband. While he was found quite severely decomposed, his body was soon identified due to his very specific tattoos. By this point, Jerry had already passed, and it was already too late for her to serve justice for her husband's murder. It was the year 1975, and 20-year-old Michael Mansfield was a student studying at Lincoln College. He was a hardworking student, but was unfortunately in a little bit of trouble with the law. He had been caught in the fall carrying stolen goods. The stolen items were record albums that he had been caught trying to dispose of in his dormitory. The district attorney decided to have mercy on him and cut him a deal. He said that he would drop all charges against him if he only turned in the person who sold him the goods. Michael agreed and would ultimately turn in 21-year-old Russell Smraker, which he knew would earn him his own freedom when he testified against him. That Christmas, Michael decided to return home to Rolling Meadow, Illinois. He spent the holiday with his parents and everything started out normal, but on the evening of New Year's Eve, he would leave home, only to never be seen again. He was gone without a trace, and police had nothing to go off of. As time went on, it would eventually become a cold case. The following year, there would be another strange occurrence, but this time it was back in the city of Lincoln, Illinois, where Michael had been attending school. It was the morning of June 2nd, and 51-year-old Lincoln resident Ruth Martin hadn't arrived at work and hadn't called to tell anybody she wouldn't be coming in. This was very unlike her. Her co-workers were afraid for her well-being, so they ended up calling her husband Richard. Richard was already at work, but he quickly rushed home to check on his wife. It was there, in their own garage, that he discovered not only a bullet, but a stain. He searched the home from top to bottom, but there was no sign of his wife. Just like in the case of Michael, there were no signs pointing towards any particular suspect, and police had little to go off of. They did end up finding Ruth's car abandoned in a nearby city with additional in the trunk. Not long after, yet another tragedy would strike the city of Lincoln, which was already reeling from all the recent crime. It was October 9th, just a few months since Ruth's disappearance, and police received a 911 call. Gunshots had been heard ringing out in what was usually a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. They were called to the home of Jay and Robin Fry, who were both just 25 years old. They had both been down and at the time, Robin had sadly been pregnant with the couple's first child. Police, who now had tons of pressure to figure out who had committed these crimes, were trying to find a possible motive and a possible connection between Ruth Martin's murder and that of the Frys. All of these individuals were well liked and didn't have any known enemies, but eventually they would come to realize that both Jay Fry and Ruth Martin had an unusual connection that you certainly won't be expecting. Both Jay and Ruth were expected to testify against Russell Smraker. It all started with a petty incident at a grocery store where Jay worked. Jay had caught Russell stealing and ended up chasing him through the store and into the parking lot. In an effort to get rid of any evidence, Russell would end up throwing the stolen items into Ruth Martin's car. It was a package of steaks that cost no more than $4. Both Jay and Ruth were expected to testify against Russell for the incident, but they never got the chance to because he would take their lives, along with the life of Robin, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what happened to Michael Mansfield, who was still missing? Police would eventually discover that Michael had also been expected to testify against Russell, but for a very different reason. He had disappeared before he ever got the chance. They now had a very clear suspect for all three of these crimes. Russell was soon after arrested and later convicted in connection to the murders. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences in prison. Throughout the years, investigators would try many times to get him to open up about how exactly these slayings occurred, but he refused. It wasn't until he was dying at 56 years old in 2011 that from his deathbed he finally confessed to the murders. While he couldn't or wouldn't answer where Michael Mansfield's body was, he did say Ruth Martin's body was buried under a highway that was under construction. Sadly, police were never able to find her body or Michael's remains. Russell would die soon after his confessions.
This has been heavily requested for a while now. A compilation of some of the stories I've read through the years that genuinely freaked me out the first time I read them. I was out doing a delivery one late night. It was probably the longest drive I've ever taken for a pizza delivery from the pizza place I used to work at. It was a 20-minute drive, which isn't too crazy out where I live. Plus, they ordered 4 large pies, so I figured it was a party and I'd get a much bigger tip. Navigating the dirt roads at night was always annoying though. I pulled up to the given address. It was some old, sketchy-looking building literally in the middle of a forest clearing. There were no cars parked anywhere, or any lights on. I put my car in park and I called my boss. I asked him to reread the address at least 3 times to make sure I typed in the right place. I could tell he was in a really bad mood, and he told me to at least knock on the door and check it out. He would normally get mad if we took back 1 pie, but I was afraid of what he would do if I brought back 4. I was insanely unnerved, but I got out anyway and forced myself to the front door of the building. There was no doorbell, so I just knocked really hard. I heard nothing, and didn't really expect to hear anything. I was extremely disappointed, not because nobody answered the door, but because I was realizing that it was all a waste of time and gas. I knocked 1 more time out of desperation, then began to hear some kind of rustling noises from inside the building. I knocked again and yelled that I was the pizza guy. There was silence now. I felt a bit more uncomfortable now than before, but before I could turn around, I noticed something at the window. There was someone looking through the window. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. All I noticed were their eyes. Their eyes were open wider than I knew possible, staring intently at me. I was disturbed enough by this to drop the pizzas and run back to my car. The shitty thing wouldn't start until turning the key for the 3rd time. I drove off the grass and back onto the dirt road, but I felt the car rocking about, shaking and bumping. Something wasn't right. I didn't make it far from the building before I started hearing a sharp scraping sound coming from outside. There was so much resistance that I couldn't even drive. The car came to a stop. I got out of the car to check what the hell was wrong. A chill ran up my spine as I began to feel like my heart was constantly skipping beats. My tires had been slashed and had completely fallen off the rim. Not just the front though. All 4 tires were slashed. I realized somebody did this when I was knocking on the door to that building. Instead of running, I got back in the car and locked the doors. I was so close to that building I could practically see it from where I was if it weren't for the trees blocking the view. I called 911 and told everything to the operator. She told me the cops would be over as soon as possible and that I need to stay hidden. I asked her if it's advisable to stay in the car or run, and she told me it would be best to stay in the car with the door locked. She asked me to stay on the line with her until the cops would arrive. My whole body was shaking. In all directions there was nothing but dark, seemingly endless forest. I knew it would take forever for the cops to get there. I was not comfortable with sitting in that car so close to whoever did this. The next part is what utterly destroyed me. It still shakes me to this day, and I hope nobody ever has to experience this kind of fear. As I was scanning all the windows, making sure nobody was outside, I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was the same person I saw at that window, eyes opened wider than ever. I could see now that it was a woman, and I could ever so slightly see a smile begin to spread across her face. I opened my door and full-on sprinted into the woods, not caring how much noise I made. I ran until I was out of breath, which didn't take long, and I hid behind a giant log on the ground. I tried to cover my loud breathing with my hand as I waited and waited for what felt like hours until I finally heard sirens in the distance. I gathered up all the stamina I had left to run all the way back in the direction of the dirt road. Eventually the glowing red and blue lights came into view, and I had never felt better in my life. They were parked in front of my car, investigating with flashlights. I came out yelling at them like a lunatic to help me. I fell to the floor and started to gag, almost throwing up from running so much. They picked me up and began to ask me questions, to which I explained everything to the best of my ability. One of the 2 cars drove over to the building, and the 2 officers began to search the building. They came back with nothing except for a couple of spiky objects. These objects were exactly the same as the ones used to slash my tires. The cops guessed that it was some kind of sick, demented couple, being that I saw the woman, but unfortunately, as far as I know, they were never found, and that still kills me inside to this day. I obviously quit my job right after that and started working at a local grocery store. I know that I'll never forget seeing that woman at the back of my car. It's a little-known common courtesy out in the mountains during a snowstorm that if someone's seeking shelter in your cabin, you let them in. No, I wasn't the one offering that courtesy to someone else in the story. I was the one seeking refuge. It was supposed to be a long weekend of hunting, but what started as a cold, sunny day quickly formed tons of dark storm clouds, and I quickly found myself right in the middle of a blizzard. After a full, rather unsuccessful day of hunting hares, I was way too far and disoriented to make my way back to my cabin. I had to seek refuge somewhere else. I came across a log cabin nestled between a circle of trees. No lights on, but I still had to try the door. I hit the door with my fist a few times. No answer, but I could hear footsteps on the other side, approaching the door. I expected it to open, but it didn't. I shouted that I'm lost and need shelter. The door cracked open, and I heard a voice say, "Come in, leave your boots by the door." I waited a bit, expecting him to open the door fully and formally greet me as anyone would, but that didn't happen, so I pushed the door open myself and entered the dark cabin. The room was lit by 2 candles, just enough for me to see the couch that the man then told me to sleep on. As for the man, all I saw was his silhouette on the far side of the room. The little light from the candles didn't extend that far. I dropped my bag and gun on the floor and laid down on the couch. I thanked the man for letting me crash here till the storm blows over. He didn't answer. His behavior wasn't the most bizarre thing. Folks are strange up in the mountains. If he wasn't up for conversation, I'd just get some early shut-eye. I closed my eyes, though the level of darkness with my eyes closed wasn't much of a difference. I was subconsciously waiting to hear the man's footsteps leave the room, but they never did. I opened my eyes, and his silhouette was still in the corner of the room, just standing there. I felt the need to say, "Yeah, I think I'm just gonna get some sleep now, thanks." No response. I turned to my other side so that I wouldn't be tempted to just keep opening my eyes to check on him. Some time passed, but without having heard his footsteps walk away, the curiosity was eating away at me. I turned over to look again, and this time, I swear to God, the silhouette of the man was closer by at least a few feet. I couldn't make out his face, but the slight glow from the candles would just barely trickle around the man's forehead, and what I saw was disgustingly pale skin. I quickly gathered my belongings and thanked him, but I said I had to go. I didn't look at him anymore, because I don't think I wanted to know what he looked like. I put my boots on outside and hurried back into the blizzard. I came across another cabin down the hill, this one with the lights on. I knocked on the door, and some old man and his wife answered the door. They welcomed me in immediately and were very inviting. They gave me some hot tea and offered me a spot on the couch. I told them my story about the freaky cabin up the hill, and the two looked at each other, puzzled. The woman confirmed 2 times the cabin I was talking about. Then she said, "Honey, the owner of that cabin was murdered 2 years ago. That cabin has been vacant ever since." I'm 27 years old. I live alone in a rural town in Virginia, about 2 blocks away from my parents. My parents are both in their 60s, and my mom has become a very worrisome woman in her old age. Sometimes she walks over uninvited and lets herself in, since I had regrettably given her a key, which can get a bit annoying. Like if I would be out really late on weekends at a bar or with women, I would sometimes come home to my mom sitting in the living room waiting, worried sick. I know you may just think, "Oh my god, that's crazy, why not just put your foot down and tell her to stop?" Well, because you don't know my mom. It's very hard to describe her, but she's the kind of worrisome, innocent little lady that you just can't bring yourself to go against. And I hate to mention, she also has mild dementia. Anyway, this was Saturday night. I think it was around 2 in the morning. I was at a nearby club with a group of college friends, really the only place to hang out in this boring town, and I was getting ready to head home. I said goodbye to all my friends and walked the 3 blocks it took to get back to my house. I walked up my front stoop in my drunken haze and dug my hand in my pocket for my keys. When I grabbed the doorknob, I realized it was unlocked. My mom was here again. I quietly opened and shut the front door, locking it behind me. I put my keys on the kitchen counter and found a note written in my mom's handwriting saying, "You forgot this at our house, next to the box of half-eaten cake my parents didn't want." I didn't see my mom anywhere, so I assumed she must have gone upstairs to sleep in the guest bed until I got back, which is something she would commonly do as well. Then I heard footsteps upstairs, confirming it, and that's when I sighed once again. 27 years old, almost 3 in the morning, and she still has to wait up and treat me like a child. I ran upstairs to check the guest bed, empty, along with all the bathrooms. I was afraid Mom was having one of her episodes due to her condition, so I ran to the phone to call my dad. After 4 rings, my dad picked up in a groggy voice, asking what the hell is the matter. After I told him that I heard Mom wandering around upstairs in my house, there was a short pause, and then he said, "That's not possible, she's sleeping right next to me." My mouth fell open as I turned my head to face the dark upstairs, and just barely by the light provided by the kitchen, I could see a head peering around from the corner at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. I screamed into the phone as I ran out the front door and down the street to my parents' house, explaining to my father on the way. About halfway there, my dad told me, "Alright, I'm gonna call the cops," and hung up. I made it to my parents' house, where my mom was already waiting at the door, worried sick. My mom explained that she did come over to clean my kitchen a little bit and to bring over the cake they didn't want. 2 police cars pulled up in front of my parents' house, where they escorted me and my dad down the street to my house. 1 officer stayed outside with us, while 2 others went inside to investigate. It felt like 15 minutes before they came back outside and said it was clear. They checked the crawl space, the attic, everything. There was really nothing for me to report, other than the door was left unlocked and I saw the outline of a head upstairs before I ran for it. Still, I didn't feel safe sleeping in there that night, so I went back to my parents' house. Me and my dad are certain that my mom simply forgot to lock the door when she left, as her memory has been getting worse over the past few months. My dad has been stopping her from coming over alone from now on, which makes me both sad but also relieved. Some nights I still get paranoid that whoever was in my house that night never left, and is still hiding in here somewhere. This is one of the few unexplainable events I've experienced in my life. I was home upstairs in my room, writing my paper for my history class. As far as I knew, I was home alone, but apparently I was mistaken, because my mom's voice called out from downstairs, yelling my name. I called back, "What?" She didn't answer, so, slightly annoyed because I didn't want to be interrupted from my train of thought on my paper, I reluctantly got up to go downstairs and see what she wanted. When I got downstairs, I looked around for my mom, but she wasn't anywhere in sight, so I yelled out, "Mom?" and she yelled back my name in response. Her voice came from down in the basement, so I went to the basement door, but strangely the lights were off. I called down the stairs, "Mom?" again, and she called back. I yelled out, "What are you doing down there with the lights off?" She didn't respond. I flicked on the light and went down the stairs. I heard my mom call my name again as I was near to the bottom of the steps. It was getting weird. Each time she called my name, it sounded exactly the same, like there was zero difference in inflection every single time she said my name. I yelled out "Mom" again, and she once again yelled back my name. She was nowhere to be seen in the basement, but then I noticed the little crawl space closet door was open. I call it that because it's a weird closet that you have to kind of crawl into, but it takes up a large chunk of the basement. That was the only place left in the basement that my mom could be. So I said "Mom" one final time. No answer this time. I went closer to the closet door and got on my knees just to try and look in. It was pitch black inside, and I was starting to get freaked out. I said, "Mom, are you messing with me?" There was no response at all, just the quiet buzzing sound from the basement light. I got back up and for some reason decided to sprint back upstairs, slamming and locking the basement door behind me. I didn't know what I had just witnessed and heard, but I went to grab the house phone and call my mom's cell number. It rang a few times until my mom picked up, and I learned that she was out grocery shopping. I told her, but she didn't believe my story, of course. She thought I was messing with her. It took half an hour of begging her to believe me that she finally went along with it, and when she and my dad were both home, we all went down to the basement together. The closet door was still open. My dad went inside, but there was no one in there. This still remains to be the most haunting, unexplainable experience of my life. There was this one time I was out late drinking with friends. It was some point in the summer of 2016. We were kind of just walking around town and then around the neighborhood when one of my friends spotted someone hiding in a bush. He pointed and said, "Look," and we all walked a little closer to get a better look. We could see what he was talking about, but just barely. It was bizarre, like someone hiding in this bush in front of this house. When we got too close, apparently, this weird, off-putting sound started coming from the bush. So we all screamed and laughed and ran away. We screamed because it was scary, but laughed because at the same time it was bizarrely funny. And there were a lot of us, so... Anyway, we walked back to our houses respectively, assuming whoever was in that bush was just messing with people. I fell asleep pretty easily that night since I was drunk. But next thing I remember was waking up to the near pitch blackness of my room. I couldn't look at the clock to see what time it was because I literally couldn't move. I was in a sleep paralysis state. I looked around the room with my eyes only and started to hear a familiar noise. The noise we heard coming from that bush. Then I looked straight in front of me at the foot of my bed, and what I saw was pure nightmare fuel. It was what appeared to be this floating, grotesque, horrific head of a demonic ghost-like thing. As it got closer to me, I realized it wasn't floating. There was a body, but its body blended in with the blackness of the room. Its mouth hung open, and it just kept making the familiar noise from the bush. It got mere inches from my face before it suddenly just faded away, and I was able to let out a scream and move my body. I sat in my bed, panting and heart racing. I flicked on the lamp and checked around my bed, but that demonic thing was gone. What I just experienced seemed so real, like I was awake for it. It wasn't a dream. I told my parents about it the next day, and they agreed with me that it was sleep paralysis, though they had never heard of anyone seeing freaky shit like that before. I work nights for the sheriff's department in Bergen County. I've been on the force for 2 years. I haven't seen too much craziness aside from late-night drug arrests, a few robbery calls, and a few assault calls. Northeastern Bergen County is pretty low crime after all, so those are usually the worst calls I deal with. There was this one night that I received a disturbance call to investigate a scream that came from a house nearby. Usually a call like this would mean a domestic dispute, or even just something as harmless as people drinking and being too loud. I arrived to the house though, and I had to confirm twice that it was the correct house because none of the lights were on. There was a car in the driveway though, a blue Toyota Sienna minivan. Someone was home. I went over to knock on the door a few times. The neighbor must have seen my car because he came out and walked over, reporting that he was the one to call the police. He told me he heard a blood-curdling scream from the house, and that the woman who lives there lives alone but occasionally had her boyfriend over, making it slightly more concerning. I tried the doorknob now, which was locked. I then made my way around the house, trying all the windows, which were all locked. All but one of the backyard windows. It was already slid completely up, enough for someone to climb through. This was a red flag considering every other window was closed. I requested backup to the scene, and once I got confirmation, I climbed into the house through the window. I started to flick every light on that I could find in the house, starting in the kitchen and working my way to the living room. And yes, it's advisable for police to turn on the lights when investigating buildings. What you see in TV shows and movies where they leave the lights off is only done for suspense. I called out for the woman, trying to assure her it's okay, police were here. Though at that time, I still didn't know what exactly the situation was, other than she was reported screaming. There was no response no matter how loud I yelled. The first floor was clear, so there was only the upstairs left to check. I wanted to wait for backup to arrive, because I was nervous what I'd find up there. But I'd also not forgive myself if I waited and wasted precious time that I could have used to save this woman from a possible medical emergency. Before going up the stairs, I unlocked the front door for when backup would arrive. I then walked up the carpeted stairs quietly, and as I got halfway up the stairs, I peered over the ledge onto the second floor. There were 4 doors up there. I flicked on the light switch in the hallway and called out one more time. I heard a creak-type sound come from behind one of the doors, so she had to be in there. I opened the door, and it was a bedroom. The light was off, but the light from the hall was plenty to see a woman laying in bed under the covers. I saw the back of her head. I walked over to her to make sure she was okay, but as I was close, I noticed dark stains that soaked the other side of the covers. The side of her I couldn't see from the door. I yanked the covers off the woman and realized it was blood, and she'd been stabbed multiple times, but she was still breathing. I grabbed my walkie and reported a stabbing, requesting immediate backup and an ambulance. The creak I heard moments before suddenly made no sense if this woman was in bed like this, and given she was unconscious, someone placed her in the bed most likely. I did a 360 in place, looking around the room. There was a closet. It was instinctively the first place I'd think to look. I had my gun drawn, and had my hand on the doorknob for 5 seconds, gathering the courage to yank the door open. When I finally did, there was no one inside. I turned around again to look at the bed, at the bleeding woman. Then I thought, the bed. I got on my knees to be level with the bottom of the bed. I yanked the bed wrap covering the bottom of the bed up, and I was then eye to eye with a man wearing a face mask covering the lower half of his face. I shrieked and yelled, "Show me your hands." He slowly raised his hands above his head as much as he could. I got up and told him to get out from under the bed slowly and made sure he wasn't holding the knife. I had him stand in the corner with his hands up until my backup came. I wasn't about to try and handcuff him in there alone, when he could have any weapon on his person. I told backup to meet me upstairs, and when they entered the house, I called up to them. Only then did I place the man under arrest. An ambulance arrived not too long after, and the woman was rushed to the hospital, and she managed to survive being stabbed 6 times. The man who did it was in fact her boyfriend, which I didn't find too surprising, honestly. The man had found out that she cheated on him with his friend, and when he called her about it, she broke up with him over the phone, and this must have caused the man to snap. I'm just very thankful the woman survived. This story was told to me by my best friend's uncle, who works the night shift as a police officer in our city. A year or so ago, Mike, my best friend's uncle, was out on his nightly patrol with his partner Steve. They've been working together for years, and they're both Army veterans, so they're very level-headed and calm people, perfect for being police officers. When they got a call from a landlord at an apartment complex complaining about one of his tenants, they didn't really expect anything bad. They get calls like that all the time, so they headed over to see what was going on. When they arrived, the landlord greeted them outside. It was probably 1 or 2 in the morning, and everyone from the complex was standing out in the grass, which was odd. The landlord approached Mike and Steve and started to rant about one of their neighbors being crazy and turning all of the water on in his apartment. Apparently he was some guy in his 30s, and he'd been acting weird lately. Mike could see that there was water seeping out from the front door to the place, and decided they had to go in and do a welfare check on the guy. When they walked in, water was pouring down the stairs and clearly flooding the building, which meant that this water had to have been turned on for hours to cause this kind of damage. They climbed to the 2nd story and knocked on the door where the water was gushing out from. The landlord told them that the tenant's name was Adam, and so they pounded on the door calling his name. No one answered for a couple minutes, and so they decided to break the door down. When they did, they spotted Adam standing in his kitchen. All of the sinks, the shower, and the toilet from the bathroom and a hose from outside were gushing water everywhere. Adam was standing there shaking. His eyes were wide, like he was terrified to move. "Adam, what's going on? Are you all right?" Mike asked while his partner Steve walked further inside to check everything out. Steve walked into the bathroom to turn off the water and to make sure no one else was in the apartment. Mike slowly approached Adam, who seemed terrified because he was shaking so much. He didn't even look at Mike as he approached. Again, he was asked what was wrong, and he finally stuttered out that there are people in the walls. Mike didn't hear what he was saying at first, but as he got closer, Adam started to hear it over and over, louder and louder. "There are people in the walls," until he was almost screaming it, getting himself worked up. Steve walked into the bedroom next and was clearing the room when he checked the closet and noticed something as he turned on the light. There was a very faint line that ran across the wall. At first he didn't think anything of it, but then he heard what Adam was screaming, and a sinking feeling hit his gut. The more he stared at it, the more he realized that the line was in the shape of a door cut out of the wall. It clearly wasn't meant to be there. Mike was about to lead Adam out of the apartment when Steve suddenly called to him, "You better take a look at this." Mike went into the other room to see Steve pointing his gun at the wall in the bedroom, clearly freaked out. They both approached the door, guns raised, while Adam started to cry in the back room. Steve quickly pulled a piece of wall back, and they both froze when 3 sets of eyes stared back at them. 3 people were pressed together in this tiny space in the wall, their faces painted in weird patterns. Both Steve and Mike ordered them out and handcuffed each one. By that time, backup had arrived and some other police officers got Adam out of there. They led the 3 downstairs and sent them off to jail. Mike and Steve were deeply disturbed by the whole exchange. It was only made worse when a couple months later, they found out that the 3 people on the wall were from some crazy cult out in the woods. They were trying to get Adam to join them. They preyed on him because they knew he had a past history of being mentally unstable. They were trying to scare him. He turned on all the water in an attempt to flush them out of his own home. To this day, Mike and Steve say that this was the most disturbing call they've ever been on. This one time when I was working a 12-hour overnight shift, I went out on a call for a suspicious person walking house to house, knocking on doors, and saying things to people through their doors or to their doorbell cameras. I arrived to the man's house who called it in, and he explained better in person that it was a middle-aged woman with long, wiry hair holding something behind her back, going door to door yelling at people to open up and mumbling to herself. The man who called the police had a Ring doorbell camera, and so he showed me the footage that it caught. The woman came up to the door, looked at the camera for a few minutes, literally, then pressed the button. She started speaking into the mic of the doorbell, and the homeowner started talking back through his phone, starting by asking who she is and what she wants. She kept saying, "Open the door, she needs blood," and would smile and cackle each time she said it. When he threatened to call the police, she laughed and started basically punching the door and trying to remove the Ring doorbell camera from the wall. It wasn't possible to tell if the threat of calling the police is what eventually got her to leave, but when she did, the man saw that she went to the house next door. This was when he actually called 911. The footage was absolutely bone-chilling. It was like a scene from a scary movie, and it wasn't possible to tell what she was holding behind her back because of the creepy way she backed away from the door to the sidewalk, still facing the doorbell camera the entire time. There were 2 or 3 other units on this now, driving around the area trying to find the woman. It was basically a mini manhunt now, and the description being used was possibly armed and dangerous woman. I checked the nearby houses on foot really quickly, then got back in my car and started patrolling the area as well. None of us could find the woman, and then we got a report of a breaking and entering nearby. Someone had called 911 to report that someone had entered their house with a weapon, and the caller was hiding in their bedroom upstairs. The caller also had a doorbell camera and was able to see the woman entering the house through the front door, but not before looking into the camera for a few moments again. I arrived to the house just about the same time as another unit. Entering the house was easy as the front door was left unlocked, of course. We had to enter with caution though, with guns drawn, because we didn't know how dangerous this woman was, or what she could be armed with. As we entered and the foyer was clear, another officer and I shouted that the police were here, and we ordered the intruder to come out with her hands up. Then there was a scream for help from upstairs. My adrenaline was rushing, as it does in any situation like this involving armed suspects. We ran up the stairs and followed the screams for help. They led us to the master bedroom. The husband unlocked and opened the bedroom door as we got upstairs, the husband of the couple sitting and hiding in there. They hadn't left the bedroom since the woman had entered the house, and they said she had been clawing and banging at the door only a few minutes ago, and that they didn't hear her leave, let alone even go down the stairs. We had to check every other room in the upstairs for her, and in one of the corner bedrooms, in the pitch blackness, we heard a cackling sound. Not being able to see her, but to hear her, was downright spine-chilling. I flicked on the light to the bedroom, and she was there sitting on the bed, already looking at me and smiling. She had a huge knife in her hand, and there was blood soaking the bed sheets that she was sitting on. It was her blood. She had just cut one of her wrists. She started saying exactly what she was saying on the first guy's doorbell camera, that she needs blood. We didn't know who she meant, until noticing the little doll sitting between her legs. It was a little girl's doll, covered in the woman's blood. We yelled at her to drop the knife with our guns drawn on her. She just laughed and kept saying what she was saying. There was clearly something very wrong with her, and reasoning with her didn't seem like it would be possible, but we tried anyway. I asked her who is this she keeps referencing, and tried to talk nice to her, saying she doesn't have to hurt herself or anybody else and that we're there to help her. But as she continued to stare at us, mainly at me, and laugh and keep muttering barely understandable sentences, I got increasingly nervous. I had my gun aimed at the giant knife in her hand, contemplating shooting it out of her hand, considering if that was a viable, safe option. But neither of us were expecting what happened next. The crazed woman sprang off the bed and made this growling sound as she was about to lunge at me and presumably attack me, as her knife was raised in the air. I reacted the only way I could in the moment, and I shot at her twice, both times hitting her in the arm, as even though I was still trying to have my sight aimed on the knife, I wasn't expecting her to just jump up suddenly. She dropped the knife and started to scream and cry as she grabbed her arm. We took this moment to subdue her and place her in cuffs. We had to get her an ambulance immediately before she'd bleed out. From the hospital, she'd later be transported to a local jail, and she was later found not guilty on all charges by reason of insanity. She's currently a patient at a mental asylum in my city. The horror that every party involved in this incident had to go through was unimaginable. From all the people who were scared to open their doors, to a crazed woman welding something unknown behind her back, to the couple that actually almost fell victim to her in their own house, to myself and the other officer that were on the scene before she was in custody. It was the scariest experience of my 10 years being a police officer.